college football couldn't get any crazier. It did this week as Michigan knocks off Ohio State 13-10, and what, quite frankly, has definitely been one of the most shocking results, if not the most shocking result of all of the season this year. And now we're getting to a point where it's probably triumphing in terms of being just as crazy as the 2007 season, from what I can recall. And watching this Michigan-Ohio State game, Ohio State, they were 20-point favorites, and I think to everybody, who was watching the game, at least initially, that they would clearly be favored in this game. Obviously, I've said this multiple times, Ohio State being the most talented team in the country, Michigan having an anemic offense, throughout the season, and, in big games all this year, whether we can talk about the Indiana game or you can talk about Texas from earlier this year too. But in terms of this game, there are a couple of different takeaways that we can take from this too. Obviously, Ohio State's going to be the big story since they've lost their last 4 to Michigan. And obviously too, everything that Ohio State needed to win this game was on a silver platter. Sharon Moore's first year, their roster has had a lot of turnover, and the defense has really been the bread and butter of this team and, quite frankly, their identity as Michigan works to finally get their identity of kind of being a blue-collar team, which is what Sharon Moore essentially said after the game is, hey, we have our identity now, and we can focus on recruiting, getting the right coaching staff in there, working with Bryce Underwood, who just flipped from LSU to Michigan. So there is a lot of optimism down with the Wolverines down in Ann Arbor. But in terms of Michigan, let's give them some props too. I mean, going into this game, you're 6-5. Obviously, expectations aren't there in terms of contending for the Big Ten. But at the same time, a lot of people would argue that Ohio State and Michigan is perhaps the biggest game. It's the biggest game of the year. I mean, I think some people, before the college football playoff, one could argue that winning this game is more important than winning a conference championship, perhaps even national championship. I'm sure there's people who are local to the area who may or may not agree with that, but it's goes show it's one of the biggest rivalries in all of college football. And for Ohio State to come out like this, it's definitely shocking, needless to say. I mean, Michigan has gone through a lot this year. You can talk about the 3 different starting quarterbacks they've had. They've had some injury issues all throughout this year. They were without their star cornerback, Will Johnson, as well as their best target all season, and Colston Loveland, who has been really a rock for him in terms of consistently being open. He's a great pass protector. And also, he just hasn't got a lot of credit this year because what primarily people talk about Michigan, and rightfully so, is their defensive line. And obviously, you have some star secondary guys such as Will Johnson who are leading that front as well. But even when you look at this game full picture, I mean, Donovan Edwards went out early, and Carell Mullings, he rushed for over 130 yards and was really kind of the backbone in terms of getting this going too, because I mean, going into this game, everybody knew Michigan was not going to throw the ball, and that's what their offensive identity has been all season. I mean, you can look at the stats and say Davis Warren has thrown for 9 for 16 for 62 yards and 2 interceptions. So it's clear that they obviously don't have the quarterback necessary to really get the ball moving and for them to have sustainable drives. But at the same time, it's a testament to what Michigan has done this season and the turnaround that Wink Martindale has led for this defense. And at least to me, the big turning point of Michigan's season in terms of them defensively, I would argue, would be the Indiana game. They only lost 20-15 in that game. They shut down Curtis Rourke. They didn't allow him to extend plays with his feet, and they did a brilliant job of being able to contain the pocket as well as not letting some of those receivers really get any sort of separation whatsoever. And in many ways, you saw the same thing with Ohio State. I mean, they're one of the best teams in the country, and Michigan could not do anything in terms of the offensive side of the ball. But now shifting over to Ohio State, there's just so many questions that you have answered now. And obviously everybody on, every analyst in the world and media people are absolutely going crazy about this game, and rightfully so. I mean, there's a few things that you can talk about that I would certainly find questionable, needless to say. I would say first and foremost, which I have down in my tracker, is the insistence on Ohio State running the ball. And I get Will Howard had a little bit of an injury issue, in the first half. And Will Howard obviously didn't play the game that he wanted to. And yes, you do have Jadrevian Henderson and Quashon Jenkins. You have a very good 1-2 punch that majority of teams in the country you could take over games with that running duo. The issue that I have with Chip Kelly's game plan for this game is number one, you didn't bring in Chip Kelly to run the ball. I mean, let's face it, everywhere that he's gone, he's primarily running out of the shotgun, not a lot of pro style, a lot of big vertical players, air raid type of offenses that rely on being able to have receivers who have yards after catch and guys who can get open in space. I mean, that's Chip Kelly 101. For you to go into this game versus Michigan with the defensive line that they have led by Mason Graham, it's just crazy that you're going to sit there and tell me, oh yeah, Henderson and Will Howard are just going to run it up the middle on Michigan, no problem. And that's just, to me, just laughable. I mean, even if you watch any Michigan this season, as well as my preview of them, that was going to be the biggest strength that Michigan has, is 9 times out of 10, they can stop teams from running the ball, which leads to the whole point of this video is, should Ohio State move on from Ryan Day? And I've said this before on the program, and I'll say it again, but I think now that they've lost to Michigan for the 4th straight time, it's, I get a couple times that you have, a top 5 versus a top 5 team. You're under Jim Harbaugh for a number of those times. And yes, I'll give you a bypass for a handful of those, and that's okay. But when you have this on the silver platter and you have one of the top most talented teams in the entire country, it's just inexcusable. Only put up 10 points, 250 yards worth of offense, and just some very questionable clock management and play calling throughout the entire game. We can even go back and look and talk about the last drive of the game. Michigan ran the ball 11 straight times on that final drive. And once when they realized that it was about 2 minutes left and they were, in essence, about to score, if I were Ohio State, I would have just one of the questions that Gus Johnson and Joel Klatt were asking is, I might let him score here with a minute left. If you can let him score with a minute left, at least you give Will Howard and your team a shot at being able to tie this game up, as opposed to letting Michigan just essentially kick what is essentially a chip field goal shot 25 yards and then not be able to get the ball back whatsoever. So that's one of the things that you have to ask yourself. And also, if you're Ryan Day, also the scenario where they essentially called 2 timeouts in a row, you had a critical 3rd down play, and you ask yourself, okay, we're going to call a timeout. Let's see how it looks, and we'll make a couple adjustments. Perfectly understandable. But the fact that you coming out of the timeout, you have 12 guys on the field, then you come out and have a late adjustment, and then you try to call a timeout again. It's laughable that you're coming out like that. It's inexplicable and it's inexcusable for Ohio State to be in this critical moment and for them to not have it together. And at this point in time, it really does come down to coaching. And if you're an Ohio State fan, you have to ask yourself, can they win a national championship with this type of nonsense going on? And I think Ryan Day deserves a lot of credit for what he's done. He's had a lot of regular season success, a number of Big Ten championships, and he's made some playoff appearances and not getting as far to where he needs to be. But the reality of it right now is they essentially are going to have to win a national championship if Ryan Day wants to keep being the coach of Ohio State, because one of the things you have to ask yourself in terms of moving on with Ryan Day is, okay, let's say they make the college football playoff and they lose in the 1st round. Let's just say that's the hypothetical. If that's what's going on, then who would you bring in to replace Ryan Day? I think that's obviously the first question you'd say to yourself. And also, there's going to be some sort of buyout in play too. I don't have the exact figure on what that is, but you got to imagine that's at least $10-15 million plus for you to get rid of Ryan Day too, especially when he signed an extension. I think it was a season. It was not last season, maybe the season before. So either 2022 or 2023, where he signed an extension too. But you just get to a point, especially after the press game conference, when he was in essence justifying the decision making that he was doing. It just kind of ask yourself, it's going to eventually, these games, it's going to be the straw that hit the camel's back. And this is a game that is just cannot happen again under any circumstance, especially when you come off versus Oregon and you only lose by a point, and essentially you pretty much ran out of clock to win that game. But if you're Ohio State, you definitely have to be a little bit nervous about this. I mean, a lot of people thought, myself included, that Ohio State would just steamroll Michigan. They would go and play Oregon in the Big Ten championship, and then they'd both end up being in it. Now, Ohio State will still have a chance in the playoff because they're obviously they're 10-2, and your only losses are to Michigan and to Oregon. And Michigan obviously isn't the best loss to have on your resume, but it's certainly not the worst one to have. I mean, they're a gritty team right now. They're still going to be bowl eligible, 7-5, and I think Sharon Moore has now found the blueprint that they need in order to have sustained success. But if you're Ohio State, you're at the point now where you really have to win a Big Ten championship and a national championship in order for you to justify keeping Ryan Day for this long. At the end of the day, he's had 6 or 7 seasons to instill his program, instill his vision. They made the gamble of essentially letting Kyle McCord go to bring in Will Howard, and you put all your chips on the table in terms of NIL, recruiting, fundraising, and all that stuff. And right now, you just don't have anything to show for it if you don't win the national championship. So yes, I would definitely agree that this probably is national championship or bust for Ohio State. And if they don't win a national championship, expect a ton of pressure from boosters, from donors to move on from Ryan Day and find somebody who could win a national title at Ohio State.